So picking up where we left off, last time we talked, we were looking at 1863. We were looking at the Gettysburg Address, the Battle of Gettysburg, and that happens on July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, 1863. And then on July 4th, 1863, Ulysses S. Grant forces the town of Vicksburg, Mississippi to surrender, which gives the Union control of the entire Mississippi River.
Speaking of Grant and Vicksburg, I would be remiss, since I was right next to it, taking my daughter to a volleyball practice, to come over here and pay homage to the general. As a National Historic Site, the parking lot for Grant's Farm is just right down the road there. So next time you're here at Grant's Farm, right next to it is the actual house where he actually lived, the one that's famous for Grant's Farm. He built that house, Hardscrabble, the one that's over there in the Grant's Farm ground. But if you look back there, there is a green home through there, and that is actually where he spent most of his time when he was living here in St. Louis. It was his wife's family house. They decided that they were going to retire to the city of St. Louis, and so this was the countryside at that time, and so Grant and his wife had this house after his in-laws moved into the city. So next time you're down here close to Grant's Farm, going to see the animals, come across here and actually go see the actual house that Grant lived in. That then brings us to 1864. By 1864, Abraham Lincoln thinks he has the solution to his problems. Ulysses S. Grant has been successful everywhere he has went, and Lee has beaten a succession of generals that Lincoln has hired in the East, and then Lincoln was frustrated when he finally gets George Meade to defeat Lee, but then he lets Lee get away, and so Lincoln decides, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take Ulysses S. Grant, and we're going to bring him east, and he is going to be made lieutenant general. And the last lieutenant general was George Washington. We're going to put him in command of every Union army, and Grant will be the guy that knows how to take down Robert E. Lee and the Confederates. And so that's what happens. Ulysses S. Grant comes east, and he is going to go head-to-head against Robert E. Lee. And Grant leaves his most trusted subordinate, William Tecumseh Sherman, to take over in the West, which was Tennessee by their definition of the West in those days. And the plan is twofold and simple. Grant will attack and defeat Robert E. Lee. We'll go after Lee's Army of Northern Virginia and capture Richmond. And Sherman will go after Atlanta, which was the second most important Confederate city after Richmond in terms of supplying weapons for the war. And so the plan is to take those two cities, remove them from the equation, and defeat the Confederate armies that are defending those two cities and end the war that way. Now, at this point, the war looks like it's all but lost for the Confederacy. Lee has taken this massive defeat at Gettysburg, and then they lose control of the Mississippi River the next day, literally. And, Grant is carving up the Confederacy everywhere he goes. But you have to remember, it's not over for them yet. The Confederacy does not have to gain a military victory. That's not what this war is about for them. Remember, Jefferson Davis said, all we want to be is let alone. So they can win by not losing. And that's significant because 1864 is a presidential election year. Abraham Lincoln is up for re-election. So if the Confederates can string this thing out and make the war unpopular, maybe Lincoln loses, and maybe he's then replaced by a Democrat that is much more willing to negotiate with the southern states and give them independence, and some sort of other negotiated settlement. And then the situation is that it plays right into Confederate hands. Ulysses S. Grant is an aggressive, accomplished general, and he takes his army straight at Robert E. Lee, and he loses. Robert E. Lee, on the field of battle, first time they go head to head, Lee out generals Grant. And the difference, though, is the day after that defeat, unlike every other Union general that came before him, Grant doesn't retreat. He doesn't run back to Washington, D.C. and replenish supplies and rebuild the army and come up with another grand strategy. After he loses to Lee, all he does is go south again. He goes around Lee's army and goes towards Richmond again. And Lee gets in front of him again, the Army of Northern Virginia, and they once again defeat Grant and the Army of the Potomac. And what does Grant do the next day? He goes south again. He just keeps going south, going south, going south. Militarily, this is exactly what the North needed to do. Remember, they have every advantage on their side. They have more men, they have more money, they have every material advantage that you can think of. And the way to defeat the Confederacy is to bring those numbers to bear. And so Grant is just pummeling Lee and the Army of Northern Virginia towards Richmond. But the reality of that is that again is playing right into Confederate hands, because Grant is losing soldiers by the thousands and doesn't seem like he's, got any kind of, the other generals had more glorious strategies how they were going to take Richmond. Grant's just using the numbers and going right at Robert E. Lee. He actually gets in a position south of Richmond in a place called Petersburg in Virginia, and there Robert E. Lee stops him, and they're going to fight each other for 10 months on the outskirts of Petersburg, Virginia, and it becomes trench warfare. This is a preview of World War I, the last year, basically, of the American Civil War. World War I should not have been a surprise to the rest of the world. If they watched the American Civil War, they knew what World War I was going to look like. Sherman, on the other hand, is successful in moving towards the outskirts of Atlanta. He drives his Confederate opponent down towards Atlanta. But by the end of the summer, he has not taken Atlanta either. And so as they move into the fall of 1864, Grant and Sherman have lost thousands of soldiers' lives, and they haven't captured their two major goals here. It looks like, for all the world, that the grand plan has come to nothing. And by the end of the summer of 1864, Abraham Lincoln is convinced that he is going to lose the presidential election. He actually writes a piece of paper up that says, I'm going to lose the election, so I'm going to have to figure out a way to bring the country back together after my defeat, but before the new guy is sworn in. And he has his cabinet sign off on this. He's that sure that he is going to lose this election. And of all the people that Lincoln is going to be replaced by, the person that the Democrats have nominated is George Britton McClellan. George McClellan, the guy that Lincoln fired twice. Remember, he's the one that Lincoln was frustrated that he didn't do more when he had Lee's battle plans at Antietam. And so that is the Democratic nominee. Now, one school of thought the Democrats had in nominating McClellan was that his army did love him as the guy that organized the army and taught them how to be soldiers, and some general that they thought really looked after them. So that the school of thought was that the Democrats were using McClellan to try and lock down the soldier vote. So that's the election of 1864. Lincoln is sure he's going to lose, and of all the people that are going to replace him, it's going to be the guy that he fired twice. And there's some really famous photos there of that's Lincoln and McClellan sitting down in McClellan's tent after the Battle of Antietam. Lincoln goes out to the field actually to see McClellan and ask him, "Hey, can you get after this guy? And McClellan refuses ultimately, so that's why Lincoln pulled the trigger on firing him. Sherman takes Atlanta right before the election of 1864. So in September, 2 months before the election, and after Lincoln had made up his mind that he could not possibly win, Sherman finally achieves one of those two big goals in the capture of Atlanta. And with that, the people of the North realize, you know what? We're actually going to do this thing. All the blood, all the money, it's been put towards an effort that is finally going to be successful. And we didn't come this far just to quit now. And with that, Lincoln is going to secure enough support to win re-election. And that was the last chance that the Confederates had to win the war. They were never going to defeat the North militarily after Gettysburg. But if they could have got Lincoln to lose in 1864 and had him replaced by George McClellan, of all people, then they probably could have won. But Lincoln's reelected. He's going to be the president for the next 4 years, and that's the writings on the wall for the Confederacy. What happens after that? Sherman doesn't just take Atlanta, but he and his men eventually decide that they're going to really begin the whole idea of total war. Now, that's probably something that you heard about in world history. Total war is the idea that an army in the field is not the only target for military purposes. The people back home are responsible for helping to arm and equip and supporting that army in the field. So under the idea of total war, they are also military targets. The factories that make the guns, if you can target those and destroy that factory, well, then that gun's never on the battlefield to shoot your soldiers. So that makes the gun factory a legitimate target. So the idea here is to wage total war on Atlanta, to remove Atlanta as a possible source of support for Confederate armies. So Atlanta is burned to the ground. The city of Atlanta is wiped off of the map. And Sherman then decides that he's going to take that same kind of attitude and bring it to all of Georgia. What follows is Sherman's famous March to the Sea, where he and his armies are going to spread out about 40 miles wide, and they march a couple hundred miles to Savannah, Georgia, and they wreck and burn and destroy everything they possibly can as they go. The only thing that they're leaving behind are the chimneys of houses that have been burned. They're taking all the food. If they can't take it with them, they're lighting it on fire. Then they get to Savannah, and then it's really famous that Sherman then sends a telegram to Lincoln giving him the city of Savannah as his Christmas gift. So Sherman burns Atlanta, makes Georgia howl, as he says, as he goes on this march across Georgia. And then once he's at Savannah, he turns north and he starts heading up through South Carolina. And as bad as Georgia got it, South Carolina's getting it worse, because in his mind and his soldiers' mind, South Carolina, they started it all. Remember, it was South Carolina that left the Union first. It was there that Fort Sumter was fired upon. So South Carolina felt the wrath of Sherman's army even worse than Georgia did. In the spring of 1865, Grant finally captures Richmond, and it, like Atlanta, is destroyed. And that sends Robert E. Lee fleeing across Virginia as he's trying to avoid his entire army getting captured. And he is finally captured in a little sleepy town called Appomattox Courthouse out in the less populated part of Virginia. Ironically enough, the guy's house that they use as for the surrender ceremony, a guy by the name of Wilmer McLean, actually owned one of the farms where the armies fought at Bull Run, and he decided he was going to get out of that path between Washington, D.C. and Richmond. So he goes out in the middle of nowhere and buys this farm at Appomattox Courthouse, only for the war to eventually find him. And what you're looking at in that picture is Wilmer McLean's front parlor. He used to say that the war started in my backyard and ended in my front parlor, and that was literally the truth. Now, it's good for the country that General Lee does surrender, because he could have potentially told his soldiers to scatter, and they could have taken to the mountains and fought on guerrilla warfare. Could have became a generational thing, maybe even. But Lee wasn't built that way. His mindset was, we tried, we lost, admit defeat, go see Grant and surrender. He said, even though I'd rather die 1,000 deaths, in his mind, the right thing to do was to surrender. And Lee, for all the world, thinks that he's going to be taken prisoner and probably be hung, be put to death for this, because he has been leading a rebel force trying to overthrow the United States government for the last several years. You usually don't have that happen and get away with it. But when Lincoln and Grant had talked about this, how to treat the Confederate Army if and when they finally captured him, Lincoln basically told them to let him up easy. So the terms that Grant gave to Lee and his army were incredibly generous. Nobody goes to jail. Nobody gets arrested. Lee is not going to go to jail. You can see in that picture, he's dressed up in his last best uniform there, because he thought, I'm trying to make a good impression here as I get captured. But he's actually released that day. Nobody in his army is held that day. Grant lets officers take their sidearms with them. If the people own their own horses, take them with you, because you're probably going to need that horse to go pull a plow and go put a crop in the ground. It's time to get back to the work of being an American citizen. Actually, Grant gives rations, gives food to Lee's army so they can feed themselves on their way home. And so, for all intents and purposes, that ends the war. Now, there are other Confederate armies in the field, but they're all going to be surrendering over the next couple of weeks. And Robert E. Lee's army was the dominant army in the Confederacy. So most people point to that April 9th surrender of Lee's Army of Northern Virginia as the end of the war. And Grant, lets them all just go back home and become citizens again. Because that's very much, as we'll see, what Abraham Lincoln wanted them to do. It was, his mindset was that this country has bled enough and people have been punished enough, with the death and destruction. It's time to get back to the business of being Americans again. We don't know how far Lincoln might have taken that mindset. It's on a Sunday that Lee surrenders. Okay. On Good Friday, 5 days after that, Lincoln decides that he and his wife are going to go take in a play in Washington, D.C. And the original plan was for the Grants to join them. Now, the Grants do not join them because Mrs. Grant did not like Mrs. Lincoln. That's kind of stuff that you don't always read in history textbooks. But the two ladies did not get along. So Mrs. Grant told Ulysses S. Grant, make up any excuse you want, but we're not going to the play with that woman. And they didn't. They ended up hopping on a train to go to New Jersey to see one of their sons in school. So the Lincolns are going to go see a play at Ford's Theater. The play they're going to watch is Our American Cousin. Now, that play is not famous for any other reason, but that's what Lincoln was watching when he was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, who is one of the famous Booth brothers. There was a set of brothers, and their father, actually, were all famous actors in the United States at that time. And Booth spent a lot of time in Washington, D.C., actually spent enough time in and around D.C. that when he was there, he had his mail sent to Ford's Theater. That's a picture of Ford's Theater on the exterior. And so he had learned from the owners of Ford's that day that the Lincolns would be coming that night. And Booth, as a white supremacist and a Southern sympathizer who had never actually joined the Confederacy, decided that he was going to use this opportunity to try and get even for the South, that he would kill Abraham Lincoln. And he had this whole cast of ne'er-do-wells that followed him, and they were all going to kill different leaders of the government. And so Booth had this plan that they were all going to basically behead the government of the North there in April of 1865. So Booth takes steps to prepare for the assassination of Lincoln throughout the day. This is the presidential box where Lincoln is going to watch the play, and then there's a little foyer behind that, and Booth sets up where he puts a little bar in there to bar the door. Secret Service existed, but it wasn't their job to watch the president. The president had one bodyguard, and as soon as he got him inside the theater, he basically considered his job done for the night. The bodyguard actually goes to the bar next door and starts drinking. So Booth is able to sneak all around the theater as much as he wants because he was there all the time, and nobody would have thought twice about John Wilkes Booth being in the theater. And he knows the play really well, so he decides that he's going to wait until there's some laughter. He knows where the lines are that will get a response from the crowd. And during one of those times where there's a rise in the laughter, he sneaks into the presidential box, gets in behind the presidential box, or into the presidential box behind Lincoln, walks right up behind Lincoln, and shoots Lincoln in the back of the head. He pulls a dagger. There is another couple that join the Lincolns. He stabs the guy, and then he decides that he's going to make a very kind of showy exit, and he's going to jump over the railing there at the presidential box and land on stage, and then yell the Virginia state motto, Sic Semper Tyrannis, thus be it always to tyrants, death to tyrants, basically, and then run off the stage. Well, he shoots the president, and there's a moment of silence. Nobody knows what that was. There's some people that thought it was part of the show. Booth comes over the railing and catches a spur in the bunting, those flags that are hanging off the front of the box there. And so instead of landing smoothly on his jump, and you can see in that picture there with my kids there at Ford's Theater that's a jump of more than 10 feet. Instead of landing smoothly on both feet, he lands with all of his weight on one foot and breaks his ankle. With the adrenaline rushing and everything, though, he's able to drag himself across the stage, walk off the stage and yell his death to tyrants, and then goes out the back and jumps on his horse and rides out of Washington, D.C., really before anybody can really even realize what's going on. It's only after the smoke of the pistol shot starts to come out of the presidential box, and then finally Mrs. Lincoln starts screaming, and the guy that was stabbed starts yelling, "Stop that man," that people realize that something terrible has happened. Now, what happens next then, Lincoln is never going to recover any consciousness. The bullet goes into the back of his skull and stops behind his right eye. His heart is beating, but he is not going to be awake from any point forward. He is actually taken across the street from Ford's Theater, and that's a picture of my kids there in the lower right corner in the Peterson house where Lincoln was taken. They didn't take him back to the White House because the army doctor that just happened to be watching the play said that if they move him, he's going to die on the way, so you might as well let him rest easy, that this is a mortal wound. And so they put him on that bed, which wasn't big enough for him. They had to kind of lay him on there crooked because he was, again, a tall gentleman for the day, especially 6'5". And so that was the final resting place of Abraham Lincoln. He passes away early the next morning. The whole country then is in mourning as his body is going to be taken on a tour of the United States after that. The aftermath here, Booth is eventually tracked down and killed by Union forces 13 days later. Other members of his cast of characters here that helped him pull this off are put to death, including a couple of Lewis Powell here, who actually did try and stab the Secretary of State. Some of the other jobs that were given, like George Atzerodt, who was supposed to kill the vice president, decided to get drunk and do nothing instead, kind of lost his nerve. And so, but they were all put to death, including Mary Surratt, who owned the hotel where they met and planned this and did a few things to help Booth, like get his weapons where he wanted them. And one of the controversial characters, it was controversial that Mary Stuart was put to death, but also another controversial part of this was that Dr. Mudd, who Booth goes to visit to get his legs set, is put in jail. And he was sentenced to life, but President Johnson pardoned him later. Mudd always maintained that he didn't know who Booth was, and that's a load of BS. It's been proven now that Dr. Mudd definitely knew who John Wilkes Booth was. And so when he set his ankle and didn't tell anybody where Booth was as he was trying to escape, that it was, he's dirty. He's part of this. And he definitely didn't help try and track Booth down. So that idea that he was just some poor, unfortunate bystander that got swept up in this is not accurate. The doctor's name eventually becomes kind of part of a saying. I don't know if you've ever heard anybody say, "My name is Mudd," when things are going against him, but that's where that comes from. Lincoln's body is taken on a tour of the United States. They actually retrace the route that he took on to Washington, D.C. when he became president in 1861. And I just like to share this photo with you, just an interesting photo here. That is Lincoln's funeral procession in New York City. Now, if you look in the building here that they're going by on the second floor, you'll see that there's two little faces in that window as the Lincoln funeral procession goes by. That face right there is of future President Teddy Roosevelt. So Teddy Roosevelt, as a very young child, watched the Lincoln funeral procession. We know that that's Teddy because this was the Roosevelt house, and the only person that would have been that age in that house at that time was Teddy Roosevelt. So there's two Republican presidents in this picture, one that is a former one who's just passed away and a future one there, Teddy Roosevelt. So I just always think that's really interesting, as intersection of history there. One of the things that's actually strange about this is that the South has lost a friend in Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln wanted to be forgiving, but that's not necessarily going to be the case of those that come after him. Lincoln might have been one person that could have gotten history to be different. I've always said that it sounds weird to say this, but from a historical standpoint, and the way we view him today, Lincoln getting shot protected his historical reputation. He's the president that saw us through the Civil War. Reconstruction is going to be such a mess that I don't think even Abraham Lincoln would have been successful in making it work. So, he wins the war and then his story is over. What is the rest of the country left to deal with? There's 750,000 citizens that are now dead. Thousands of miles of railroads are destroyed. Entire cities have been burned to the ground. A lot of the people that do come back home are, going to be missing arms, legs. Some southern states had 10 to 20% of their state budget go towards artificial limbs in the years right after the Civil War. Even though some people come back physically, they're going to be damaged mentally from this for the rest of their life. The havoc and the damage just is going to last generations. As I show you there, they thought this might be just one fight and then it would be over pretty quickly. I think that if that had been the case, it probably wouldn't have led to any great change. But this war has been lost and won over 4 years' time and has cost $750,000 lives and millions of dollars. So it's interesting how that's going to change the equation as this is going to be considered. And there's a couple of photos there of Atlanta, Georgia, and Richmond, Virginia. And when I see those photos, especially that one of Richmond there on the upper right, it reminds me of photos that you probably have seen of Germany post-World War II, where it's just fragments of walls and there's no ceilings and roofs left in it. And that would have been scenes throughout the entire South. Cities have been leveled and homes have been destroyed. Okay. All right, with that, you need to click on that link right there in your notes and answer those questions.